30 years ago this spring, Russia was at the beginning of what would be dramatic, although uneven economic recovery, following the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991. At the moment of the Soviet collapse, Russia inherited a budget deficit that was conservatively estimated at 20% of GNP. It faced the threat of hyperinflation. Economic growth was negative. There were shortages throughout the economy. Foreign reserves were virtually non-existent, and it was racking up a mountain of international loan commitments. In today's video, we will be showing you how Putin made an ESS will cause the downfall of Russia. Without further ado, let's begin. To be sure, Putin's hardening autocracy, especially after his return to the Kremlin in 2012, worked against further socioeconomic gains rather than in their favor. After 2014 and the annexation of Crimea from Ukraine, and just as the global pandemic began in 2020, real wages were dropping. Wealth inequality was rising, and foreign investment had fallen to levels not seen since 2003. Nevertheless, Russians had never lived longer or better since the collapse of communism, even if still below most other post-communist countries. At purchasing power parity, Russian GDP per capita peaked in 2019 at $29,967, just below Poland and Portugal, for example, a little less than twice that of China, and about 4 times higher than in 1999, the first year of clear post-communist economic growth in Russia. A great deal, though not all of Russia's economic progress could be attributed to its revenues from oil and natural gas exports. But oil prices had long since dropped from their sky-high values of the early 2000s. In 2019, oil prices reached $64 per barrel, a little more than half of their all-time high in 2012, and despite the sanctions imposed by the United States and European allies following the Crimean annexation in 2014, Russia's economy continued to squeeze out an annualized growth rate of 2.1% in the year before the COVID-19 pandemic. But if 30 years of uneven post-communist recovery had seen Russia's resurgence, we are now seeing its ruin. Vladimir Putin's autocracy has not just wrought havoc on Ukraine, it has wrecked Russia too. In a little more than 8 weeks, Putin's unjust and ill-conceived war has erased the gains of the last 3 decades. The toll on Ukrainians is far greater than on Russians in material terms and, tragically, in lives lost. Ukrainian bravery in the face of Russian barbarism, however, has made Ukrainians a nation of heroes, while Russians have been rendered international pariahs, unable to travel abroad easily and suffering under the heaviest sanctions ever imposed anywhere in world history. The burden of Putin's war on Ukraine will be borne by average Russian citizens for decades, if not longer. The damages done to Russian society, the economy, its military, its political development, and its international reputation will far outlive Putin. Here are some of the ways in which Putin has managed to ruin Russia. The pariah economy. The most obvious catastrophe that Putin has brought about by invading Ukraine is and will be economic. Scholars at Yale Business School reported that more than 1,000 international companies had curtailed or shuttered their businesses in Russia by the 8th week of the war. More will surely follow. Most Russians won't feel much pain from the shutdown of Aston Martin or Burberry, but the unavailability of repair and replacement items from companies such as Apple, Bombardier, Boeing, DuPont, Ericsson, Intel, and Analog Devices will hit labor productivity, consumers, and eventually the supply and production chain of Russian industry. These exits will also leave hundreds of thousands more Russians unemployed. Longer term, with Putin and the Duma threatening to confiscate any remaining assets of companies that have quickly fled Russia, few foreign investors will return anytime soon. It is sadly reminiscent of what happened to the Russian economy when the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917. The heavy sanctions regime imposed on Russia since February will not soon be lifted given the Russian military's brutality. Sanctions work slowly and are a somewhat clumsy tool to deter and punish a state for its behavior. We haven't yet seen their full effect on the Russian economy. Yes, some of Russia's super-rich cannot access their yachts and mansions in London, Rome, or Zurich. They cannot send their children abroad for school, nor can they or their family members travel outside of Russia for the time being. While these are inconveniences, the freezing and seizing of their assets in foreign banks hurt more. Although as long as they continue to support Putin and reconcile themselves to remaining in Russia for the rest of their lives, they will survive. Putin only allowed economic modernization up to a point and was slow to encourage diversification of the economy. While Russia sells military equipment and weaponry abroad, chemicals, coal, precious metals, and civilian nuclear power plants, Revenue from these sectors almost certainly cannot ramp up fast enough to replace what has been and will be lost from oil and gas exports to Europe. Even if China increases its purchases of Russian oil and natural gas, it cannot replace the European market for Russia. And China will undoubtedly drive a hard bargain, using the enormous leverage it will have obtained over Russia in the absence of a European alternative market. But at the start of the Russian invasion, Nabiullina was rumored to have quit her post because Putin's war was destroying all she had accomplished for the Russian economy. He refused, however, to accept her resignation, and she was recently reappointed for a third 5-year term to oversee the undoing of her past policies. A closed society. This long and yet still incomplete list of damage to the Russian economy will continue to unravel all the health and demographic gains that Russia had made before the February invasion. Gains made despite Putin's leadership, not because of it. Population growth had leveled off by 2018 or so, reversing the demographic catastrophe of the late Soviet period and 1990s. But Putin's invasion of Ukraine has hastened what had already been called the Putin exodus of educated young professionals that had begun after 2015. The BBC reported in mid-March that as many as 25,000 Russians had already arrived in Georgia, while others went to Turkey and Armenia because airspace to Europe and North America was closed to Russian flights. One estimate put the number of Russians who had fled the country in the first 4 weeks of the war at up to 200,000. Cyberspace, too, has become far more restricted since the Russian attack. Russia's 80 million Instagram users had to say goodbye to the platform in the first few weeks of the war. The Russian government's ban on the platform followed blocked access to Facebook and Twitter because they refused to bend to the Kremlin's demands that they stop attempting to censor official Russian state media, destroying Russia's standing in the world. Finally, Putin's war has ruined Russia's reputation abroad. In the months preceding the war, as Russian forces amassed on Ukraine's border, both he and his diplomats consistently maintained that Russia had no intention of invading, and that, of course, without provocation, they did just that. They acted in bad faith in violating repeated ceasefires to allow Ukrainian civilians to evacuate cities, such as Mariupol, before the Russian military turned them into rubble. The Russian military has violated the laws of war in clearly targeting civilians throughout Ukraine, and Russian soldiers and their commanders have used rape and torture against civilians in Bucha and elsewhere. And so the cycle is complete. 3 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, Russians are being dragged back in time to when Soviet citizens lived isolated from the rest of the world, in a bubble of failed ideology and misinformation. That system fell apart under just the kind of autarky and autocracy that Putin hopes to reimpose. Just as the Soviet system collapsed, Putin is also failing Russia, erasing the gains of the post-communist period in a feckless attempt to rebuild a doomed empire.